Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. The beloved community belongs to divine oneness, and so does all that it achieves. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Valarie Kaur of the Revolutionary Love Project. I so wish I could be with you in person this afternoon. I am currently on maternity leave, and so I could not travel to you, but my beloved friend and mentor, Victor Kazanjian, and the amazing team at URI, they found a way for me to be with you all virtually. And for this, I am profoundly grateful. For I believe that the work that you do in the world and the work that you have been doing at this convening is of urgent importance. I'd like to begin by honoring the ancestors of the land on which we're standing, the Ohlone people, and honor the elders who held the Waters of the World ceremony this morning. With your permission, I would like to share with you my story and the message of what I've come to call revolutionary love. I became a civil rights activist nearly 2 decades ago in the aftermath of September 11th. In the wake of the horror of those attacks, hate violence erupted on city streets across America, and members of my own community were killed. The first person killed in a hate crime after 9/11 was a turban Sikh man, Balbir Singh Sodhi, a man I called uncle, murdered by a man who called himself a patriot. I was a junior at Stanford University, sitting where you are now, and in my grief and in my despair, I felt the urgency to join a generation of Sikh and Muslim advocates who wanted to make our community safer. So I learned how to make films and organize and became a lawyer and worked with different communities on racial and social justice issues, from supermax prisons to poor neighborhoods, to the sites of mass shootings, sometimes when the blood was still fresh on the ground. And with every film and every campaign and every lawsuit, I thought we were making the nation safer for the next generation. Fast forward to 2016, at the time when white nationalists hailed this presidency as their great awakening, when executive orders and policies began to rain down on us, still rain down on us, hate crimes began to skyrocket once again. But now I was no longer a student, I was a new mother. And as people hurled the word suicide bomber, now with our son at our side, I had to come to terms with the fact that a generation of advocacy had not made our nation safer. And that my son, a little brown boy with long hair who might someday wear a turban as part of his faith, that my son is growing up in a nation more dangerous for him than it was even for me, more dangerous than it was even for my grandfather, who first arrived in San Francisco a century ago. And I had to reckon with the fact that there will be moments in the street or the schoolyard when I will not be able to protect my son, because Sikh and Muslim Americans in America today are still seen as terrorists, just as Black people are still seen as criminal, brown people illegal, Indigenous people savage, queer and trans people immoral, Jews as unwanted, women and girls as property. And when they fail to see our bodies as some mother's child, it becomes easier to ban us, to deport us, to detain us, to separate us from our families, to sacrifice us for the illusion of security. You know, I realized after this last election that the last time that my body was in this much pain was on the birthing table. You see, there is a stage in birthing labor that is the most painful stage. It is the final stage in labor. It's when the body expands to 10 centimeters. Contractions come so fast that there is barely time to breathe. It feels like dying, but it is called transition. During my transition, the midwife said that she could see my son's head. She said to breathe and to push, but all I could feel was a ring of fire. And I turned to my mother and I said, I can't. But my mother was already reciting a Sikh prayer that my grandfather had taught us. Tat divana lagi, the hot winds cannot touch you. You are brave, she said. You are brave. And just then I remember I saw my grandmother standing behind my mother, and her mother behind her, and her mother behind her. a long line of women who had pushed through the fire before me. I took a breath. I pushed. My son was born. You see, this stage called transition, it feels like dying, but it precedes the birth of new life. And I began to think about birthing as a metaphor. So you know how we talk about being a warrior or soldiering on? So only a subset of men for most of human history have gone to war, but it's a useful metaphor for all of us. So too, only a subset of women have had the experience of birthing. It is not special, just distinct. And it seems to offer wisdom for all of us. So the metaphor of birthing began to fill my mind. And a new question began to form in me. A question I have been asking every day the last 2 years. What if? What if this darkness in our nation and in the world right now, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a nation still waiting to be born? What if all of our ancestors who had pushed through the fire before us, those who survived genocide and occupation, slavery and assault, what if they are standing behind us now, whispering in our ear, "You are brave. You are brave"? What if this is our time of great transition? My sisters, my brothers, my siblings, I believe that you are convening at this time when our nation and our world are in transition. For at this very moment of this convening, we know that far-right supremacist movements are on the rise in the United States and around the world, propping up demagogues, mainstreaming nativism, undermining democracies, politicizing the very notion of truth. And that at this moment, America itself is in the midst of a massive demographic transition. Within 25 years, the number of people of color will exceed the number of white people for the first time since colonization. We are at a crossroads. Will we? Will we birth a nation that has never been? A nation that is multiracial, multi-faith, multicultural, multi-gendered, where power is shared and we try to protect the dignity of every single person? Or will we continue to descend into a kind of civil war? A power struggle with those who want to return America to a past where a certain class of white people hold cultural, economic, and political dominion. You see, I believe the stakes become global when we think of climate change. The same supremacist ideologies that justified colonialism, the conquest and rape of black and brown people around the globe. You see, those same ideologies justify industries that accumulate wealth by pillaging the earth, poisoning the waters, darkening the skies. Global temperatures are rising, the seas are rising, storms are coming, fires are raging, and our current leadership is doing nothing to stop it. Humanity itself is in transition. Will we? Will we marshal the vision and the skill and the solidarity to solve this problem? Will we labor together to birth a new future? Or will we perish? Is this the darkness of the tomb or the darkness of the womb? I don't know. All I know is that the only way we are going to birth a new future is if we show up, is if every single one of us shows up in the labor. This brings me to you. You see, you are the peace builders and the policymakers. You are the grassroots lawyers and the global leaders. You are the faith leaders and indigenous healers. You have at your hands thousands of years of stories and scriptures, songs and poetry to help people labor for justice with love. And that means that you are the midwives in this time of great transition, tasked with birthing a new future for all of us. Because here's the thing, already in our pursuit of justice, too many of us have been tempted to become what we are fighting. We cannot spout the same words back at the other side. We cannot mirror the vitriol that we are resisting. We cannot become what we are fighting. And we cannot let ourselves burn out. Already so many of us are tired. I know, because I am tired. And when we are tired, we grow numb. And when we are numb, it becomes easy to retreat into whatever privilege we have. So how do we stay in the fire? How do we keep pushing into the fire? The greatest social justice reformers in the last century, from Gandhi to King to Mandela, they sustained entire nonviolent social movements that changed the world because they anchored people in the ethic of love. Love as a moral imperative and a pragmatic choice. So what might it mean to reclaim love today as a force for justice? This is my work. This is the work of the Revolutionary Love Project, and I am so grateful to you or I for honoring us with the award last night. It means the world to me. I launched the project 2 years ago with a band of volunteers, and our vision has been to produce stories and tools and social actions to equip people like you to fight for social justice with love. We built a team of researchers from the fields of ethics, conflict resolution, education, and neuroscience to develop a 3-part framework for what I have come to call revolutionary love. And we are defining love not just as a rush of feeling, but we're looking to mothering and parenting to see that love is a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, life-giving. This is why I believe that revolutionary love is the call of our times. Revolutionary love, the choice to enter into labor for others, for our opponents, and for ourselves. So I would like to share with you the 3 practices we've identified for how to love others and our opponents and ourselves, with the hope that they might be useful to you. So number 1, how do we love others? We call this practice see no stranger. See no stranger, the words of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh faith. So brain imaging studies have shown us that our minds see the world in terms of us and them in an instant, before conscious thought. Who we see as one of us determines who we feel empathy for, who we feel compassion for, who we stand up for in the streets and at the polls. So the primary act of love that we have identified is wonder. It is to train people to look upon the faces of others with wonder and think, sister, brother, sibling, you are a part of me that I do not yet know. I choose to wonder about you. I choose, therefore, to hear your stories. I choose to grieve with you and fight for you when you are in harm's way. This is an evolution of the golden rule. Love others as you would have them love you. So this is love others as they would have you love them. This is an orientation to wonder and humility. And so I ask you, whose stories have you not yet heard? Who have you not yet grieved with? What new coalitions can you build? In what brave new ways does love call you to labor for one another? Because we know that love requires more than prayer. Our interfaith movement has become strong because we know that love requires us to show up for others at the vigils and the marches and the polls. Love requires rising up together in the thousands, in the millions, marching in the streets and flooding the halls of power. In the United States, I have seen you. I have seen you standing your ground at Standing Rock, making Black lives matter, rising up to declare Me Too, and showing up in the wake of bloodshed in our houses of worship. From a synagogue to Pittsburgh to mosques in New Zealand, you have shown up to grieve together and to organize together. And I have seen you behind closed doors, in our churches and our gurdwaras, at prayer circles and organizing rooms. You are grieving together. You are raging together. You are caring for one another, even when it's hard, even when our families are suffering, even when our communities are suffering. I have never witnessed solidarity this deep before. And each time I see glimpses of what is longing to be born, a nation that has never been, a world that has never been, and yet still must be. You see, I believe that our future depends on the strength of our social movements. And our movements are only as strong as our solidarity is deep. And solidarity that is not grounded in love can wash away with the tide. Which brings me to number 2. How do we love even our opponents? How do we fight our opponents with love? We call this practice tend the wound. Tend the wound. You see, it's very tempting to see our opponents as evil. But there are no such thing as monsters in this world. Only human beings who are wounded. People whose insecurities or anxieties or greed or blindness cause them to hurt us. Our opponents, the terrorist, the fanatic, the demagogue in office are not people who don't know what else to do with their insecurity, with their suffering, but to hurt us, to pull the trigger or cast the vote or pass the policy aimed at us. But if some of us begin to wonder about them, listen even to their stories, we learn that participation in oppression comes at a cost. It cuts them off from their own capacity to love. We begin to see that our opponents are radicalized by cultures and institutions that we together can change. Loving our opponents is therefore not just moral, it is pragmatic, it is strategic. It focuses us on not just removing bad actors, but remaking institutions of power. As someone who identifies as a progressive in America, that means that while I care about unseating this president, I must care more about changing the conditions that resulted in this presidency. This is why I believe it is time to shift the frame in our movements in America and around the globe, from resistance to rebirth. So resistance is required for survival, but resistance alone points us to what we are fighting against, not what we are fighting for. Resistance alone marshals the energies of revenge, rebirth the energies of love. Our goal is more than to stop the next crisis or win the next election. Our goal is to birth a just world for all of us. So I ask you, what does it mean to labor for a world where we can coexist even with our opponents? What are the cultures and institutions that have radicalized your opponents, that authorize them to inflict harm on you? What is your role in changing those conditions? This often requires us to listen to our opponents, to not let our grievances blind us to their humanity. And this is hard work. I get it. This is hard. So you remember Bulbirunko, the first person who was killed in a hate crime after 9/11? Well, a few years ago, we reached out to his murderer in prison. It was so painful for me to sit with Frank Roque and to listen to him. But as I began to listen longer beneath the slogans and the sound bites, I began to hear his pain. I learned that forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is freedom from hate. And I could begin to see that the white nationalist violence that is erupting in America and around the world comes from a distorted worldview and unresolved grief and rage, conditions that we can change. So I know for many of us, it is not yet safe for you to listen to your opponents. It's not safe when you are directly in harm's way. So we must let others do that labor right now. That's why we are a movement. Each of us has a role. And those who are directly in harm's way must tend to their own safety. So this brings me to number 3. How do we love ourselves? We call this practice breathe and push. You see, thought leaders like Gandhi, King, Mandela, they taught us a lot about how to love others and our opponents, but not so much how to love ourselves. This is a feminist intervention. This is Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde who say that caring for ourselves is not indulgence, but a form of political warfare. For too long have women and women of color been told to suppress our rage, to suppress our grief, to discard our own wellness in the name of love and forgiveness. But our suffering is not service. The movement can no longer happen on our backs or over our dead bodies. In all of our labors, the labor of building a career or raising a family or making a movement or birthing a new nation, we need people to help us breathe and push through the fire of our emotions. We need to be able to create the wellness in our lives that we want out in the world. The midwife tells us to breathe and then to push, because when we are pushing into the fires in our bodies or the fires in the world, we cannot breathe alone. We need to be breathing together. So I ask you, how are you breathing each day? Who are you breathing with? Breathe with the ones you love. Breathe with the earth and sea and sky. Breathe with music and movement and meditation and prayer. Breathe to summon the ancestors at your back. Because this practice of revolutionary love requires bravery. Love is only revolutionary when it is poured in all 3 directions. Loving only ourselves is escapism. Loving only our opponents is self-loathing. And loving only others is ineffective. We need to be practicing love in all 3 directions for love to be revolutionary. And revolutionary love can only be practiced in community, which is why I am so grateful that URI has convened you these last few days at Stanford University. Because after you leave here, there will be moments when you are back in the field, back facing the fire, when you will say, I can't treat this patient. I can't lead this protest. I can't change this policy. I can't serve this community. I am not strong enough. I am not smart enough. I am not good enough. I am not enough. And in those moments, I ask you to remember that we don't go to battle alone and we don't give birth alone. In order to push into the fires in our bodies, the fires out there in the streets, we need someone by our side to tell us, to whisper in our ear, you are brave. You are brave enough. So I leave you with this question. Who makes you brave? Can you think of one person you have met at this conference who you might lean on in your darkest moments? Can you think of their name, the person you will reach out to when you need to remind yourself how brave you are? I think of the name Victor Kazanjian. Victor, thank you so much for being that person for me, for offering your friendship and wisdom, for returning me to the labor again and again, for being a kind of midwife to me. Thank you. These days, on my darkest days, when I return from the vigil, from the latest mass shooting or the protest in the street, and I don't feel like smiling or doing anything, it's my son, who's now 4 years old, who helps me breathe. He tugs on my sleeve and he says, "Dance time, Mommy?" And we dance. Even on the darkest nights, we dance. And at first, I just sort of move around like this, so not wanting to be there. But then the music starts to rise and my son starts to spin around and I start to smile, and then he hands me his baby sister who's now 7 months old, and I throw her up in the air and joy floods into me and I start laughing. You see, joy gives us energy. Joy is our greatest act of moral resistance. Joy reminds us of everything that is good and beautiful and worth fighting for. My wish for you, especially the young people in the room, may you protect joy every day. It's what I wish I had learned when I was standing at Stanford 2 decades ago, that the labor for justice lasts a lifetime. The truth is, there is no end to the labor. But when we labor in love, it is enough. It is enough. You are enough. So I say to you, be bold, be brave, and with your ancestors at your backs and your brothers and sisters at your side, let joy be your lifeblood. Thank you so much. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.